Just the other day, I was introduced to a New Yorker who was visiting some friends of my wife's here in Germany. When I asked him if he spoke any German, he responded with a smile. Nope, not at all, not one word. And his smile spoke volumes. He wasn't ashamed. He actually seemed proud of the fact that he didn't know any German. Unfortunately, his case is probably pretty common. And it's a big reason why I want to look at another stereotype Europeans often have about Americans. That Americans are absolutely terrible at foreign languages. And honestly, there's definitely some truth to that stereotype. Welcome back to English Naturally, where you learn English through real, understandable content. If you understand around 70% of what I'm saying, that's perfect. And if you need help, the subtitles are there. So, are Americans actually worse at foreign languages? Is there something about the structure of American society that makes them less likely to master a second language? And what exactly is going on with this strange pride some Americans seem to have about not knowing another language? Because in many parts of Europe, speaking only one language can almost feel embarrassing. So why are Americans so different? Are they lazy? Arrogant? Are they simply bad at languages? Or is there something deeper going on culturally? In this video, I want to examine that stereotype by looking at the statistics, the history, the geography, and even the psychology of linguistic dominance. And by the end of this video, I want to explain why I actually don't believe Americans are naturally worse at language learning at all. But first, let's be honest. Compared to Europeans, Americans generally are much worse at foreign languages. In countries like the Netherlands or Sweden, it's normal to meet people who speak English, their native language, and often another European language too. In fact, the Dutch, that is, the people from the Netherlands, seem to all speak English at a near native level. Seriously, the only distinguishing factor of their accent, that is the giveaway that they're not American, is the hard TH sound they make. So instead of saying other, they will say utter. But it's really subtle, and other than that, their English is flawless. Meanwhile, many Americans struggle with very basic Spanish after years in school, or depending on which junior high or high school you go to, German or French. And this might be surprising given the American stereotype of not being great at languages, but we are all required to take 2 years of a foreign language to get into a university. In fact, some of the more competitive universities require 3 years. I myself actually took German in junior high, meaning in 7th and 8th grade. Everyone I knew did it this way because the classes were a lot easier in junior high. And that was great for my college resume, but not so much for my German acquisition. I can truthfully say that after 2 years of German in junior high, I could at most make 2 or 3 simple sentences. Stuff like, I am athletic, and I like the color brown. And sadly, I am not exaggerating. And I am not alone. In fact, according to the US Census Bureau, around 20% of Americans speak a second language. But keep in mind that this 20% also includes immigrants or bilingual households. So of course you have children of Mexican immigrants, children of Chinese immigrants, and Korean immigrants who speak American English without an accent. But this is not the stereotype I'm talking about. The stereotype I'm talking about refers to native-born English-speaking Americans from monolingual households. And there does seem to be a lot of truth to that stereotype. Get this, in the US, at any given time, only around 20% of students in high school or earlier are enrolled in a foreign language class. Compare that to Europe, where in many countries, 80 to 90% of students are learning English in school. In Germany, they start it in 3rd grade and continue with it until they are done with high school. So in Europe, being able to converse in 2 languages is not really that exceptional. In fact, you might say it's the standard. Meanwhile, in the US, only about 1 in 5 claims to be able to speak a second language conversationally. One might well argue that Americans are intellectually lazy, culturally uninterested, or simply arrogant. Especially when you hear them saying so proudly and without 1 ounce of shame, "I don't speak a word of German." However, I think the deeper explanation is much more interesting than simply saying Americans are lazy or arrogant. So let's look at that now. One of the biggest reasons is geography. Americans grow up inside a gigantic English-speaking bubble. You can drive 10 hours, 15 hours, sometimes even 20 hours and still be surrounded by English. Meanwhile, in Europe, languages change constantly. You can leave Germany and within a few hours be in the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Poland, Denmark. Honestly, it's one of the main reasons I love living in Europe so much. Drive a few hours and you get a completely different culture. True, Alabama is different than, say, Southern California, but the language is still the same, even if the accent is quite different. The point is, Americans never really experience foreign languages as a necessary reality, unless, of course, they have the great privilege to travel abroad. Statistics show that around 20 to 30% of Americans travel internationally every year. So many Americans rarely encounter a situation where another language becomes necessary. That's very different from here in Europe, where in most cities you can hear all manner of languages being spoken. In other words, one is confronted with other languages in a way Americans simply are not, which in a way explains why the Dutch are so skilled at English. They live in such a small country, they likely realize the need for English. And that changes motivation enormously. Because language learning usually happens when there's pressure, necessity, or emotional motivation. And most Americans simply never experience that pressure. To be honest, I visited my family earlier this year and it was crazy to notice the difference. In my life in Germany here, language learning is so much of my identity. With my accent, I'm immediately recognized as a foreigner, and I speak German and French at a high level. But as soon as I landed at the airport, all these languages were completely irrelevant. They were not in any way necessary. But maybe you're saying, well, wait, what about Spanish? Aren't there areas where a lot of Spanish is spoken? You know, places where there's a lot of Mexican immigrants? Yes, indeed, there are areas where the Spanish language is quite visible. And I'll talk more about this later. But first, let's look at another reason why Americans don't feel the same pressure to learn a second language. English has become the international language. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that China is a growing power and that huge portions of the world speak Spanish. But if we're talking about international business, science, tourism, entertainment, technology, English still gives you a massive advantage, and this creates a very strange situation. Americans can travel to many parts of the world and simply expect, yes, expect, that people will respond to them in English. Honestly, it's a little crazy when you stop and think about it. I remember once overhearing some Americans eating in a restaurant here in Germany. Now, the town where I live is actually fairly small and not especially international, so I was curious what they were doing there. As a good American, I politely inserted myself into their conversation and started talking to them. I'll spare you the details, but one thing that came out very quickly was how annoyed they were that not everyone spoke English. And honestly, I felt a little embarrassed listening to them. But at the same time, the broader reality remains true. English became dominant because of history. The British Empire, American economic power, Hollywood, music, technology, the internet. And once English became global, something important changed psychologically. Americans stopped needing to adapt linguistically, at least in the same way many other people do. Most Europeans understand this instinctively. If 5 people in a room speak perfect German, but one person only speaks English, very often the entire room switches to English. In other words, Americans usually don't adapt to Europeans linguistically. Europeans adapt to Americans. And that creates a strange psychological situation where Americans almost never need to experience linguistic discomfort. And honestly, I think this might be the biggest reason Americans developed such a bad reputation for foreign language skills. Let me explain. Americans often hate feeling incompetent publicly. I mean, who likes to feel incompetent publicly? But particularly in America, we're trained to be confident. There's even a phrase, fake it till you make it, which reinforces this idea. In America, you're supposed to speak confidently, present yourself confidently, sell yourself confidently. And speaking a new language, it forces you to sound stupid for a while. You suddenly sound like a child. You make mistakes, you search for words. And I think many Americans subconsciously avoid situations where they lose social status or competence, especially adults. I seriously think this is the difference between Americans who are able to master a second language. It has nothing to do with ability and a lot to do with humility. I remember very well the feeling of the first few years in Germany when I struggled in German to express my thoughts. And I always thought to myself, if only you knew how smart and intelligent I am in my mother tongue. I am so articulate in English. But as we say, before you learn to walk, you gotta learn to crawl. And so I kept at it, and I learned to laugh at my mistakes and learned to be comfortable with not sounding as intelligent as I wanted. It required a bit of humility. And a change not only in how I perceived myself, but in how I allowed others to perceive me. Now, of course, Europeans feel this too, but Europeans are often forced through this discomfort much earlier. For Americans, it's easier to escape back into English. And so you have people like Emily from Emily in Paris, who skips around Paris for years and never really learns the language, and then complains about how hard it is to learn French because everyone speaks English so well. Sorry, Emily, I don't empathize. Well, maybe I do. It is true that, as an English speaker in Europe, learning the local language can be difficult because so many people will switch to English to do you a favor. In fact, I was very proud when my German was better than the English of almost everyone I met. This way, it finally made no sense for them to switch to English. Okay, we've explained several reasons for why Americans are bad at foreign languages. Let me now talk about the most controversial one. Because there's another uncomfortable reality in America. Languages have prestige, fairly or unfairly, for many Americans, especially languages like French, Italian, or Japanese. These can feel sophisticated or culturally prestigious. But Spanish in the United States historically became associated with immigration and working class labor. And I honestly think this affected motivation more than Americans want to admit, because people are often motivated to learn languages connected to status, to travel, prestige, and aspiration, not just practically. For better or worse, a lot of Americans are not that motivated to learn Spanish to better communicate with the migrant class or even connect more with the neighboring country. And to be honest, a similar situation exists, at least here in Germany. Turkey is very close, and a lot of Turkish people moved to Germany for many of the same reasons Mexicans moved to America. And it's not like the majority of Germans are studying Turkish in school. Okay, I'm almost done here, and thanks for sticking around to the end, by the way. But now I want to talk about the part that personally changed my life. Because for years, I also believed something that many Europeans still believe, that language learning mostly happens in childhood. That if you don't start super young, you'll never really become fluent. Honestly, this is a topic that can take up a whole video, so let me summarize it quickly. Young or old, we all need massive amounts of exposure to the target language. We need repetition, we need to make mistakes through awkward conversations, etc. So while it is true that children get the structure to do these things, that is, they are put in situations through school where they have to have awkward conversations, but are also encouraged to just use the ability they have and are expected to make mistakes and are given time to improve. Adults, we are put in situations where we're supposed to talk about sophisticated topics and give interesting opinions on them. However, adults actually have many advantages over children in learning a language, but unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand the process of learning a language. I'm not going to go over them here again, but if you want to learn more about this, check out my 7 Keys to Learning English series. I'll put the link in the description. The basic idea is this: human beings are built for language acquisition. And once I realized that, it completely changed how I viewed language learning. Now I speak German at a very high level, French at a high level, and after 5 months using effective methods, can understand Italian at an intermediate level and can hold a conversation with lots of mistakes. And I started far later in life than most people think is possible. And honestly, one of the biggest tragedies is that so many adults give up before they even really begin. Learning a second language is one of the best investments you can make. It truly is a gift that keeps on giving. So, are Americans bad at languages? Well, yes, but also no. I think Americans grew up inside a system where language learning simply never felt necessary. And when you combine geography, English dominance, cultural confidence, education systems, and psychology, you get exactly the situation we see today. But I absolutely do not believe Americans are biologically worse at learning languages. And honestly, I think one of the best things about learning another language is that it forces you to become humble again. You stop being the center of the world, you become uncomfortable, you struggle. And in a strange way, I think that experience makes you grow as a person. And for me personally, learning other languages has probably been one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I probably should have mentioned this a long time ago. If you're even watching, please like and subscribe. It really helps.